I never expected to watch a billion-dollar company spiral into chaos from a cabin in Montana, whiskey in hand, watching it burn from my laptop screen. But that's exactly what happened. All because some overconfident rich kid, who happened to be the CEO's son, called the system I spent 12 years building trash and had me escorted out like a criminal. He thought he was making room for clean code and modern architecture. What he actually did was unplug the very backbone of the company's billing engine, the one I built, the one I had warned them not to touch. So I let him. I didn't sabotage a thing. I just stepped aside and watched the entire thing collapse, one failed decimal point at a time. Let me take you back. My name's Ethan Drake, and up until a few months ago, I was the principal systems engineer at Stratus Core, a financial tech firm headquartered in Denver, Colorado. You've probably never heard of us, but you've definitely used our services without knowing it. Our systems handled the behind-the-scenes billing operations for credit unions, payroll processors, and SaaS platforms across 5 continents. We didn't make headlines, but we made sure the digits lined up. Every single time. I joined when we were 20 people stuffed into an old converted firehouse in the Rhino district. We were young, wild, and terrified of bankruptcy. I built the currency normalization engine from the ground up, code that could handle a customer in Brazil paying in reais while another in Switzerland paid in francs, and make it all line up cleanly for audit and compliance across over a dozen regulatory systems. The system was not pretty, but worked. 12 years. No major outages. Not once. Then along came Brandon Langston, Harvard MBA, 27, and son of CEO Carl Langston, a man who had clawed his way to the top, but seemed blind when it came to his kids' limitations. Carl handed Brandon a title, Executive Vice President of Systems Innovation. In reality, it meant Brandon could steamroll over the very team that kept the company running, and no one could say a damn thing about it. His second day on the job, he called an all-hands meeting. I've been reviewing our architecture, he announced, standing in front of a projector slide titled Legacy Liabilities. And frankly, what I'm seeing is unacceptable. We're sitting on a house of cards. Spaghetti code. Technical debt. We're going to rewrite everything. Microservices, CI/CD, serverless functions. He was parroting buzzwords like he'd read them off a VC pitch deck. The entire engineering floor, my team, sat there frozen. Not with respect, with disbelief. I knew exactly what was coming. He had no idea how fragile the system really was, or how many silent fires we'd put out without anyone noticing. And soon he'd find out. The hard way. The day Brandon Langston took over, everything started to feel off. He moved into the corner office that used to belong to the CTO. Didn't even blink. Overnight, he renamed our primary engineering Slack channel to hashtag Reboot the Future and fired off a message dripping with false humility. Looking forward to collaborating with you all on modernizing our systems from the ground up. Let's make history. It didn't take long to realize what modernizing actually meant. He wanted to tear it all down, and he had the power to do it. By Friday, I was summoned to a technical review in Conference Room B. No agenda, no prep, just Brandon, a few of his fresh-faced hires from Silicon Valley, and me. Ethan, he began scrolling through a printout of my code like he was scanning a grocery list. What is this? He pointed to a block deep inside the currency normalization bridge, code I wrote back in 2013 to handle decimal discrepancies between Japanese yen, which has no decimal points, and Eurozone currencies that use commas instead of periods. That section, I explained calmly, handles edge cases when decimal rules shift between input and settlement formats. If we don't account for it, a 10,000 yen payment might process as $100 or worse, $1,000,000, depending on how it's interpreted downstream. Brandon scoffed. That's exactly the kind of spaghetti we're eliminating. You've hard-coded logic across currencies. It's unreadable. I raised an eyebrow. It's unreadable until you understand why it exists. Every condition in there is the result of a real-world failure we've caught and fixed over a decade. He leaned back, smirking. Real engineers don't fix mistakes. They build systems that don't allow them in the first place. I should have laughed. I should have walked out. But I just looked at him, this child in a business suit, and realized I wasn't going to change his mind. He wasn't here to learn. He was here to prove he was better than the people who actually knew how the engine ran. A week later, he had me removed from all core repositories for security during the migration process. Then my access to documentation was revoked. Then I was uninvited from team syncs. One morning, my email didn't work. Neither did my badge. By lunchtime, I was sitting across from Laura from HR, who looked more shaken than I was. Ethan, the company's going in a new direction. This has nothing to do with performance. She slid over the severance package. 6 months pay, extended health care, a non-disparagement clause. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. Brandon had just fired the one guy who could stop what was coming. But before I left, I made sure I wasn't the only one walking out that door. I took every piece of institutional knowledge I had, my personal notes, system maps, rationales, compliance crosswalks, and removed them from StrataScore servers. Not out of spite, out of survival. I didn't sabotage a single line of code. I didn't have to. They were about to refactor their way into a billion-dollar disaster. I was going to let them. It took exactly 15 days. 15 days from the moment they pushed Brandon's shiny new refactored microservices into production to the moment StrataScore's entire billing infrastructure started coughing up blood. I was in a cafe in Whitefish, Montana, sipping dark roast, scrolling Reddit when I saw the first sign of doom. r/softwareguru. StrataScore just charged me 2 cents for a $399.99 annual subscription. WTH is happening. Attached, a screenshot showing a billing line item completely missing its decimal. In the comments, dozens more. $19.99 plan billed at $1,999. My credit card got locked. Got charged $0.0045. This has to be a bug, right? I work at a startup using StrataScore. We're rolling back ASAP. Clients are flipping out. I took another sip of coffee, leaned back in my chair, and smiled. The normalization bridge was dead. They had ripped out its messy, misunderstood guts and replaced them with pretty containers that didn't know how to distinguish a comma from a period. A 1,000 yen transaction processed as $10,000. A 9.99 euro charge from Germany denied. Their system read it as 9.99 cents due to regional decimal interpretation. Brandon's system had no logic to account for global currency oddities because it looked ugly, because it wasn't modern, because it had too many if statements. And now those ifs were costing them millions. Within 72 hours, Twitter was ablaze. 3 major enterprise clients went public, suspending all usage of StrataScore, services pending audit of billing errors. Support lines jammed. Finance departments overloaded with chargebacks. Lawyers sniffing blood. The kicker? Their disaster recovery protocols depended on my original codebase, which had been archived, which no one left on Brandon's team even knew how to read. I got a text from Tom Redding, one of the few engineers who had stuck around from the old days. Tom, they're screwed, Ethan. It's a circus. We all told him not to touch your system. Me, you didn't tell him hard enough. Tom, he's blaming QA. CEO's furious. Might call you. I chuckled. Let them flail. I hadn't lifted a single finger. I hadn't touched a line of code. But I had taken the only thing that could have saved them, the context, the story behind the code, and I had packed it into a USB drive in my backpack. That weekend, StrataScore's stock dropped 41%. CNBC ran the headline. Billing bug wipes $400 million off StrataScore's market cap. Blunder or breakdown? I got 2 voicemails. One from legal. One from a VP I'd never met. I didn't return either. But on day 12, my phone lit up with a name I knew all too well. Graham Beckett, Chief Financial Officer. I answered. Ethan, he said, voice like sandpaper. We need to talk. Ethan, we need to talk, Graham Beckett said, voice tight with exhaustion and something else, panic. I let the silence hang just long enough to make him sweat. I figured you might call. I replied, leaning back in my chair. Outside my cabin window, a dusting of snow was starting to fall across the pines. Peaceful, quiet, unlike what was going on inside StrataScore HQ. We've lost 6 major clients, Graham continued. Our enterprise SLA penalties are in the tens of millions. We've had to suspend new onboarding. Support is drowning. Engineering's in over their heads. And Brandon? I asked. Another pause. He's been moved out of technical operations. Temporarily. I grinned. Let me guess. Business strategy? Special projects? We need your help, Ethan, he said, ignoring the jab. The normalization engine. It's failing across multiple currency channels. We've tried rolling back, but the containerized architecture you warn about, it's cannibalizing itself. No one can isolate the root cause. Because there isn't one root cause, I said flatly. You dismantled a system that evolved over 12 years. You thought you could modularize complexity without understanding it first. He sighed. I won't argue. You were right. So please, come back. Help us fix this. I let that sit, then spoke cool and measured. I'm willing to help, but I don't work for Stratus Core anymore. You want me? You hire me as a consultant, and here are my terms. I could practically hear him sitting up straighter on the other end. Go on. 1, I said. 6-month contract, minimum. Paid 5 times my previous salary. Up front. Monthly. Done, he said without hesitation. 2, I retain intellectual property rights to any code I write. You get a license to use it, but it's mine. That's highly irregular. So is imploding your entire billing system. He hesitated, then agreed. 3, no interference. I work independently. No project managers. No Brandon. No buzzwords. I write what needs to be written, and I deploy it as I see fit. Another bead of silence. I'll make it happen. 4, I said. Brandon Langston is banned from all meetings, code reviews, and technical decisions related to this recovery. If I see his name in a JIRA ticket, I'm out. That'll be delicate. Not my problem. Understood. I lean forward. Have legal drafted up. I'll look it over tonight. If it checks out, I'll be in the Denver office tomorrow morning. And Graham? Yeah. Tell your engineers to get some sleep. I'm bringing firepower. When I hung up, I didn't feel victorious. I felt vindicated, like the universe had finally acknowledged a truth I'd been forced to swallow for too long. Just because code is messy doesn't mean it's broken. And just because it looks clean doesn't mean it works. The next day, I flew into Denver on the first morning flight. As I stepped into Stratus Core's once pristine lobby, now buzzing with red-eyed engineers and tension thick in the air, I didn't feel like a returning employee. I felt like the man with the antidote, walking into a crisis I didn't cause, but was uniquely qualified to solve. And this time, I'd be writing the rules. The moment I walked back into Stratus Core HQ, it was clear I wasn't returning to the same company I'd left. Gone was the arrogant energy, the corporate swagger, the polished smiles. The open-plan engineering floor now looked like a triage unit. Pizza boxes stacked beside empty coffee cups. Sleep-deprived engineers slumped over laptops. Monitors flooded with logs, crash reports, Slack threads full of question marks and dead ends. This was a company on fire. Waiting at reception was Graham Beckett, dressed in last week's suit, his tie abandoned somewhere along the way. He extended his hand like I was a surgeon arriving to save a bleeding patient. Ethan, thank you for coming. I gave him a nod and scanned the lobby. The air smelled of stress and stale takeout. I need full access, I said. Every commit, every rollback, every change Brandon's team made in the past 30 days. Already arranged, he replied. You'll be set up in conference room D. We've cleared out whiteboards, hardware, whatever you need. He wasn't lying. The room had 2 32-inch monitors, a brand new ThinkPad, 6 dry erase markers, and a hastily scribbled note on the whiteboard. Do not disturb. Ethan working. A handful of engineers stood nervously nearby. I recognized two, Max from infrastructure and Sasha from compliance. The others were fresh. Brandon's hires. One of them, a young guy with a Stanford hoodie and code-darkened eyes, stepped forward. I'm Josh. I've been leading the normalization module refactor. I nodded. Great. Show me what broke. Over the next 3 hours, I dove headfirst into their disaster. Josh's team had split the normalization logic into 5 microservices, each with its own deployment container, logging system, and test suite. In theory, it was elegant. In practice, it was a maze of decimals gone rogue. One service rounded Japanese yen to 2 decimal places, which it shouldn't. Another assumed commas were delimiters instead of decimal points, which broke European entries. And a third defaulted missing currencies to USD, triggering massive overcharges. You didn't break the code, I said finally, standing and pacing the room. You broke the context. You atomized logic that was never designed to live separately. They looked confused. I walked to the whiteboard and drew 2 simple diagrams, the original bridge and the microservice tangle they'd created. This, I said, pointing to their diagram, is like trying to fix a watch by scattering its gears across 5 different rooms. Josh swallowed. We were following best practices. No, I corrected. You were following buzzwords. Clean architecture means nothing if it doesn't handle dirty realities. Silence. Then Max stepped forward. Can we fix it? Yes, but not by patching. We need to rebuild the original logic. Together. I opened my laptop and began typing. As I worked, I spoke, explaining every decision I'd made in the old code. Why the edge cases existed. Which obscure banking regulations required nested conditionals. How one misread yen conversion in 2016 nearly triggered an SEC investigation. I didn't just rewrite code, I taught them the system's soul. By nightfall, we had a working prototype. Run a batch of test transactions, I said. Start with the most error-prone currencies, yen, euros, Swiss francs. Then mix them with US legacy formats. Sasha's eyes widened as the results streamed in. All green, she whispered. No mismatches. Josh looked up. This is the first clean test run we've had in weeks. I sat back, hand clasped behind my head. Then we're not out of the woods. But we've found the path. That night, as I updated my documentation and explained every single line of the new normalization function, I noticed something odd. The team wasn't just watching. They were absorbing, asking questions, connecting dots, listening not just to how the code worked, but why it had ever mattered. It was a first, and maybe a turning point. By dawn, the fix was ready. We had stress-tested every transaction type, yen to dollars, euros to pounds, legacy batch payments, instant cross-border transfers, 0 mismatches, 0 failures. I hadn't slept. Neither had half the team. But the moment we pushed the new build into staging, a nervous energy filled the room. Like the last deep breath before defusing a bomb. I pinged Graham, ready for phase deployment. Start small. Monitor everything. 10 minutes later, 5% of live traffic was rerouted through the rebuilt normalization engine. The test cases passed. Then 20%. Then 50%. By noon, we were at 100%. For the first time in weeks, Stratascore's billing system was working as intended. Payments were processing without errors. Customer service queues were dropping. The panic finally cracked into exhausted smiles and spontaneous applause. It wasn't just relief. It was respect. I kept quiet, finishing the deployment notes while the team high-fived around me. I didn't need champagne. I had code that worked. That was enough. Until the door opened. The room fell silent. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Carl Langston, CEO, founder, and patriarch, walked in. He wasn't a man who made frequent appearances. He ruled from the top floor, far above the server rooms and sprint boards. But now he stood in the doorway, all silver hair and presence, surveying the scene like a general inspecting a battlefield. Is it done? He asked, voice low but resonant. Graham stepped forward. Yes. Full deployment stabilized an hour ago. All systems functional. Carl's eyes landed on me. Mr. Drake. A word. Now. I followed him into a glass-walled conference room just down the hall. The door shut with a sound that felt ceremonial. He didn't sit. I've read the logs. The bug reports. Your fix, he said. I know what my son did, and I know what it cost us. I waited. I wasn't about to make this easy for him. He finally exhaled. I want to thank you. Personally. I didn't come back for thanks, I said. I came back to stop the bleeding. His eyes narrowed. You could have warned me. I did, I replied. You just weren't listening. He sat down, slowly, like the weight of his company was finally pressing on his shoulders. He was trying to modernize. You know how the board pressures innovation. There's a difference between innovation and ignorance, Carl. Your son didn't just refactor my code. He detonated the entire billing foundation without understanding how it worked. And not at once. He's been reassigned. Permanently. I didn't ask where. I didn't care. We want to offer you something more permanent, he said. A CTO track. Leadership. Full authority over systems architecture. You've earned it. I looked him square in the eye. I'm not coming back. Not as an employee. His expression froze. Why? Because the problem wasn't just Brandon, I said. It was the culture that let him bulldoze 12 years of institutional knowledge without a second thought. A culture that values clean over functional. A culture that let no one challenge him because of his last name. He leaned back, silent. I continued. You want to fix this company? Start by documenting your systems. Build knowledge transfer protocols. Give your senior engineers a voice. And stop mistaking confidence for competence. And you, he asked, you'll just walk away? I'll consult, I said, on my terms, case by case. But I'm not putting myself back into a system that doesn't protect its own spine. He nodded slowly. Understood. Then just before I stood to leave, I turned back. Oh, and next time someone calls a system messy, maybe ask why it's messy before you rip it out. Carl said nothing. But in his silence, I heard something rare from a man like him. Humility. I stepped out into the hallway. The team was still working, but the fear was gone. They weren't just engineers anymore. They were survivors, learners, builders of something better. And me? I was already thinking about the next proposal. Not just to patch code, but to rebuild trust. I didn't leave right away. The code was stable. The billing system was online. Clients had started returning. But I wasn't done. What nearly brought Stratus Core to its knees wasn't just bad leadership or broken code. It was cultural rot. The blind belief that flashy frameworks beat experience. That new always meant better. That systems were only valuable if they looked pretty in a GitHub repo. I'd seen this disease before. At other companies. In boardrooms. On conference stages. But now, I had leverage. I called Graham in a conference room. I'm not here to pitch a system update, I told him. I'm pitching a culture overhaul. He blinked. I'm listening. I pulled out a simple one-page proposal. Title at the top. Preserving the Backbone, a framework for knowledge management and engineering trust. It had 5 bullet points. 1. Institutional knowledge protocols. Every legacy system must be documented, not in marketing gloss, but in technical rationale. Why decisions were made. What problems they solved. Who built them. 2. Engineer-led transition reviews. Any major architectural change requires a committee review that includes legacy system owners, lead developers, and compliance officers, not just product managers. 3. Seniority without management. Create a parallel career path for senior engineers. Not everyone wants to be a manager. Some just want to be guardians of the code. 4. Cultural re-education. Quarterly internal sessions where systems are dissected, not just for how they work, but why. Not just the what, but the because. 5. Ask before you replace. Make it policy. Any critical system flagged as outdated must be reviewed for context before being greenlit for refactor. This isn't about stopping innovation, I said. It's about preserving what actually works. Graham nodded, slow and thoughtful. You want to run this? As a consultant, I said, I don't want a desk. I want a contract, a mandate, and full authority over rollout. I'll train internal leads to sustain it once I'm gone. He tapped the proposal with his finger. This might be the most important project this company's ever done. I know, I said, because next time, it might not just be billing that breaks. He smiled grimly. I'll get the board to approve the budget. Later that week, I held the first session. I stood in front of 30 engineers in a quiet auditorium with one sentence on the projector screen. If you don't understand why a system exists, you shouldn't be the one to change it. I didn't lecture. I told stories about the 2016 payment bug that almost triggered a Federal Reserve audit, about the strange Polish bank API that required field names in reverse, about the one time a single missing if statement caused a $30,000 tax misclassification. And for once, They weren't rolling their eyes at legacy code. They were leaning in, seeing the story inside the system. One of the younger engineers, Zoe, I think, raised her hand. Why didn't anyone tell us this stuff before? I looked at her. Then I looked at the others. Because no one thought it mattered. Until it was gone. She nodded. It matters now. Damn right it does. That night, as I walked out into the Denver winter, I looked up at the straightest core building. Still sleek. Still proud. But inside, something was shifting. No more buzzword crusades. No more blind ref factors. Just the quiet beginning of a culture that finally understood what held it together. The invisible code. The invisible engineers. The invisible pillars that never asked for glory, just permission to keep doing their job. I didn't need a badge anymore. When I walked into straightest core, people no longer saw me as the guy they pushed out. They saw me as the guy who came back. The guy who saved them. But that's not who I wanted to be. I wasn't interested in becoming some mythic figure whose name was whispered whenever a system glitched or a deadline loomed. I'd lived that life. I'd built the critical systems. I'd been the silent guardian, the human band-aid, the last line of defense. And it nearly broke me. What I wanted now, what I needed, was to make sure they didn't need me next time. So I started small. I took Zoe under my wing. She reminded me of myself 15 years ago, sharp, driven, asking better questions than the senior engineers around her. But unlike me, she wasn't carrying scars yet. She still had that glint in her eye, the belief that good code could fix bad decisions. And I wasn't about to let corporate decay smother that fire. We met daily in the war room, now less of a crisis bunker, more of a classroom. I didn't just teach her how to write robust code. I showed her why fragile systems exist, why Band-Aid solutions aren't always failures, why sometimes the ugliest logic is the only thing standing between you and a public disaster. She soaked it up, every misaligned decimal, every hard-coded workaround, every API horror story. You're not just writing functions. I told her one afternoon as we walked through a messy inheritance tree from 2014. You're writing the story of how this company survives. She paused. And if someone erases the story, then someone like you will write it again. But better. Zoe started leading the internal documentation initiative. Not just technical wikis, but narratives, explainers, diagrams, voice memos from old engineers telling war stories from forgotten systems. She was building institutional memory, the very thing Brandon had erased. And she wasn't alone. A few of Brandon's hand-picked juniors, shaken but not broken, started following Zoe's lead. They asked questions. They dug deeper. They began to understand that good engineering wasn't just about elegance. It was about resilience. One evening, just before I left the office, I passed the old glass conference room where I'd once confronted Carl Langston. Inside, Zoe was standing in front of a whiteboard filled with flowcharts, walking a group of engineers through a legacy payments Q handler I wrote in 2011. She wasn't mimicking me. She was becoming better than me. That's when I knew it was time to go. I wasn't retiring. I wasn't done. But I had done enough here. Straightest core would survive. Because it had learned. And because it had people like Zoe, who finally saw the value in the mess beneath the surface. Back in my cabin in Montana, I poured a glass of bourbon and stared at the fire. My inbox was full, consulting offers from companies I'd never heard of, but who had heard about me. But I didn't answer them yet. I opened a new document on my laptop and titled it, Legacy First, Building Cultures That Remember. This wouldn't just be a career now. This would be my mission. Because somewhere out there, another Brandon was being hired. And someone needed to prepare the next generation of engineers to stand their ground. Not with ego, but with understanding. It was a Sunday morning when he showed up. I was splitting wood behind the cabin. Snow still clung to the pine trees and patches, and the air had that quiet, crisp finality that only Montana winters knew how to bring. The swing of my axe echoed clean through the trees. Then I heard the gravel crunch. I turned. A rental SUV. Black. Plates from Denver. Out stepped Brandon Langston. He looked different. Less polished. No blazer. Hoodie. Messy hair. No entourage. Just him. Alone. I didn't move. He took a few steps forward, hands tucked into his pockets like a kid approaching the school principal. Ethan, he said, voice smaller than I remembered. Do you have a minute? I leaned the axe against the stump. You're either here to apologize or ask for a job. Pick one. He cracked a tired smile. Maybe both. I didn't invite him in, but I didn't tell him to leave either. We sat outside on a pair of wooden chairs overlooking the forest. He glanced around like he wasn't used to stillness. This place suits you, he said. That's why I chose it. He nodded, fiddling with a piece of bark in his hand. I've been reflecting, he started. I got benched, moved out of ops. They gave me some glorified analytics position in biz dev. I show up. I smile. I stay out of the way. Probably smart, I said. He winced. Yeah. There was a long silence between us. I let it sit. Then he said something I didn't expect. I've been reading your documentation. I turned to him. The new stuff. No. The old notes. The ones you wrote years ago, before I deleted half the repos. Max found backups. On an archived dev server. He shook his head. You didn't just write code. You told stories in it. You left breadcrumbs, warnings, logic trees with human fingerprints. I thought I was looking at bad code, Ethan. But I was just too arrogant to read it. I looked at him, really looked at him. He wasn't the same guy who'd stood in front of a slide deck, preaching microservices like gospel. He wasn't even the same guy who fired me. He was the ghost of a guy who got humbled hard. I let out a breath. Why are you really here? He looked up at me. Because I want to learn. For real this time. No power. No title. No pitch decks. I've been talking to Zoe. She said you're writing something. About legacy systems. Culture. Survival. I nodded. I want in, he said. Not to lead. Just to listen. Maybe help rebuild what I broke. It took everything in me not to answer right away. Old anger buzzed in the back of my brain like a wasp that didn't know it was dead yet. But then I remembered Zoe's words. It matters now. Maybe that was the whole point. Not just protecting the system, but teaching those who would have destroyed it to care for it instead. Finally, I spoke. You want in? Then start by understanding the difference between good code and wise code. The former works. The latter endures. He nodded. Fair. I stood, grabbed the axe, and handed it to him. Split that log. If you can do that without breaking your foot, maybe you're ready. He grinned, took the axe, raised it, missed the center completely. I didn't laugh. I just sat back down. Good, I said. Now do again. 6 months later, I stood on a stage I never asked for. A modest tech conference in Austin, Texas. No live stream. No headline sponsors. Just a few hundred engineers, architects, and decision-makers sitting in folding chairs, nursing overpriced coffee, and waiting for someone to say something that didn't sound like a TED Talk or a product demo. I gave them this instead. You've been taught to chase clean code. You've been taught to chase speed, modularity, modernity. But let me ask you this. Have you ever inherited a system that terrified you because you didn't understand why it worked? They were listening. I walked across the stage, holding nothing but a clicker and a message. We are building towers on top of invisible pillars, written by people who've long since left. You can't fix what you don't understand. And you can't replace complexity just because it's ugly. I told them the story of Stratus Core. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. I showed code screenshots. I told them about the decimal bug, the domino effect, the silence that let it happen. And I ended with a question. What if your company's survival depends not on what you'll build tomorrow, but on what you refuse to forget today? After the talk, a line formed. A senior developer from a health tech startup shook my hand. A compliance officer asked if I'd consult on their aging reporting infrastructure. A junior engineer, fresh out of school, just said, thanks. No one ever told me it was okay to respect old code. That night, in my hotel room, I opened a blank document titled, The Legacy Standard, a manifesto for resilient engineering. It had 3 principles. 1. Understand before you refactor. No line of code is bad if it prevented a fire. Start with context, not critique. 2. Document the rationale. Not just what the code does, but why it does it that way. Capture stories, not just specs. 3. Honor the builders. Legacy isn't a liability. It's inheritance. Treat it like an heirloom, not a mistake. I published it to a bare-bones site that night. LegacyStandard.org. No ads. No buzz. just the beginning of a quiet revolution. Back at the cabin, I built a team. Small, remote, focused. Engineers who'd been burned by the same mistakes. Veterans who still cared. Newcomers who wanted to learn before they led. Zoe joined as co-founder. She led education initiatives, published technical breakdowns of legacy systems that worked, and explained why. Brandon joined too, not in leadership, in support. He ran logistics, helped onboard companies that needed help diagnosing their own blind spots. He showed up every day, no longer trying to impress, just trying to do right. And me? I wrote, I spoke, I consulted, not to climb, but to protect the craft, to ensure that somewhere, someone would think twice before deleting something they didn't understand. We don't talk about revenge anymore, because that's not what this was. This was restoration, of knowledge, of respect, of the quiet engineers who keep the world running, line by line, without applause. And if that meant I got to grow old in a cabin in Montana, watching a generation finally start to care about what came before them, that was enough. Because sometimes the most powerful revolution in tech is simply remembering what not to break. If this story made you think twice about what we call bad code, if you've ever been the silent expert, the invisible pillar holding everything together, or if you've seen leadership chase trends and ignore truth, then share this video. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever watched a system fail because no one listened? Subscribe for more real-world tech dramas and lessons from the trenches. Because sometimes the best way to build the future is by respecting the past.